Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to the NYU Stern Center for Sustainable Business 4th Annual Practice Forum. We're so happy to have you back with us on day 2. First and foremost, I'd like to thank our sponsors, Glenmead, Invest Industrial, Qintess, and to our media partner, Harvard Business Review. Please note that today's events are considered on the record and will be recorded, and media is in attendance, and we will be sharing information on social media. That said, we will also have recordings of all of our events posted on our website and our YouTube channel in the coming weeks, and all registrants will receive an email notification of that. A couple of reminders about how to navigate the Hopin platform. So on the left-hand side of your screen, you'll see a navigation bar with icons for the reception area, the stage, sessions, networking, and research Q&A. When an event is occurring in any one of those areas, you'll see a red icon that says live next to it. And if you get lost, you can always head back to the reception area and scroll down to see the full list of today's events. Of course, if you need additional support, our team is on a call, and feel free to reach out to us at any time via our email address, sustainablebusiness@stern.nyu.edu. This will also be posted in the event chat on the right-hand side of the screen. So with that, I am so pleased to turn it over to Nana Baffour, Chairman, CEO, and Chief Culture Officer at Qintess, for our first panel of the day, Technology for People, Planet, and Profit. Nana, welcome.
Oh, yes. Thanks a lot, Elisa. And you guys all, excellent. So I'm now on the main stage?
You are. Welcome to the stage. I will turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alyssa. Good morning, everybody. A big thank you for the NYU Center for Sustainable Business and Professor Tonzi and her excellent team for putting all of this together. We are very excited to sponsor it in addition to Glenmead and Invest Industrial with support from the Harvard Business Review. Today's panel is going to be talking about technology for people, planet, and profit. And this panel will explore how technology can help support sustainable strategies and solutions. I'm very excited to have 3 great leaders with me here on the panel. Samir Goel, who is the co-founder of Isuzu, David Goldhill, founder and CEO of Sesame, and Micah Kotch, managing director of UrbanX. I'm Nana Baffour, CEO, chairman, and chief culture officer of Qintess, and Qintess is a Brazilian multinational technology company focused on helping our customers transform their business models using technology. I'll share a little bit with you in the opening stages how we at Qintess think about the value and impact of technology to support sustainable strategies and solutions in commerce. And then we'll introduce our panel and get going. With that, let me talk to you a little bit about how we think about technology as an enabler for sustainable capitalism or sustainable enterprise creation. Alyssa is there on my, excellent. So as I mentioned, we're going to explore how technology can help support sustainable strategies and solutions, helping people, the planet, and of course, the bottom line. Let me start off by reminding, I think most of you participants in this forum, fellow travelers on this journey of ESG, are probably aware of the landmark article in the New York Times by Milton Friedman, the late Milton Friedman, titled "The Social Responsibility of Business is to Increase Its Profit." I think everybody is aware that that idea of shareholder primacy and its simplicity was very alluring to the business community, as well as to government, for that matter, when you think about public policy in the last 50 years. Clearly, I think, just recently, the Business Roundtable renounced that because it's become clear when you think about the crisis of 2008, Corona, all the George Floyd race riots, and a variety of things that have happened in the last 50 years and significantly within the last 15 years, that the idea of the shareholder being the single most important constituent in business is clearly misplaced. And so from our perspective at Qintess, we believe that most companies that desire to build sustainable businesses have to start off with the premise that they need to worry equally about their customers, their employees, the shareholders, of course, and the broader society. And these four constituents, in some level of equilibrium as it relates to investments and risk reward, is really how you build a sustainable business. And at Qintess, our proposition is we can help that journey by providing three big groups of technologies, because we believe that if you are going to be able to build a sustainable business that attends to the needs of customers, employees, shareholders, and society, there is three key things that you need to do. The first thing is you have to think about the experience that you can offer to these constituents. And that experience passes through, the type of user interface and design on your website, to actually process design even in your physical locations, to the way that you engage your employees internally, the type of information that you're providing, and all the apps and so forth and so on. The type of experience that you provide has to create a unique experience, and that creates a sustainable experience for your customers, employees, shareholders, and society. The next thing that we believe in is that you can't have a sustainable business if you are not financially efficient. And so that means that in this day and age where, most companies have competition from digital natives, the unit cost of production or the unit cost of transaction, whatever you do, whether you're giving loans, whether you're producing a widget, that unit cost being as low as it can be is very relevant. And the way you do that is we think technology can be a big enabler for that through automation, process mining, the type of infrastructure, cloud, and so forth and so on, that you can bring your unit cost of transaction down. And then the last thing that we believe you have to do, and this is where I think most of technology gets a lot of attention these days, is how you are gathering and using data. And that passes through, we believe, using analytics and machine learning and so forth and so on, cybersecurity, et cetera, so you can use data to make good decisions. And in so doing, you can be able to attend to these four constituents well. And we believe that if you are able to do these three big things well, you're going to have great engagement across your constituents, create great value for them. You're going to do it at a low cost. And more importantly, you're going to have the type of cultural transformation that is required if we're all going to build a sustainable world. And since we're talking about building sustainable businesses, we need some metrics. So things like net promoter score, growth, employee retention, gross margin, EBITDA, and of course, your sustainability metrics. And as it turns out, without pre-planning, these happen to be the metrics that Stern's Rossi methodology also supports. And so this is sort of how, Qintess, we believe we can enable sustainable capitalism through technology and digital transformation. And so in the end, I think our proposition is simple, that without the ability to have a planet that is sustainable and technology being used there through mitigations to climate change and so forth, and a strong focus on people, and we'll talk a little bit about on this panel, ways in which technology, frankly, can also be an impediment, it will be very difficult to have profit. And so the idea of caring for the planet, caring for people, and using technology to do that is frankly the way that you can maximize your profit. And that opens the way for the rest of the panel to come in. With that, I would invite my co-presenters, our panelists, to come on board and initially introduce themselves and provide an overview of their company's approach to using technology to effect societal impact. And a bit of housekeeping, since we're all within the Stern timeframe, I would encourage you to do your initial introductions and talking about your companies in 4 minutes each so that we can keep to the timeline. Thank you very much. And I'll call initially upon David to get us started. Welcome on the stage, David.
Thank you, Nana. Good morning, everyone. I run a company called Sesame, which is 2 years old. Sesame is one of the oldest ideas in online businesses. It is a two-sided marketplace between sellers and buyers. What makes it interesting is it occurs in healthcare. All healthcare services, from telemedicine, consultations with doctors, specialist visits, even diagnostics and surgical procedures, we list, and we list at a cash price. Sesame has been designed, frankly, for in America for the uninsured patient, and a patient with high deductible insurance who finds the burden of the deductible to be very great. It is designed as a place to find great doctors and very clearly defined procedures at fixed prices. And the prices are quite low. On average, a price on Sesame is 30-40% below your insurer's supposed discount. On the flip side, for physicians whose business models and practice styles have taken a hit even before COVID, it's an opportunity to reach new patients in a way where you know you can get paid. All Sesame patients pay upfront for a service, which gives a physician the confidence in offering a lower price. It's not just about price, because obviously having an online marketplace lets you do a lot of things around accountability, transparency, clarity, and ratings that doesn't exist in the reimbursed healthcare system. So in a sense, what we're creating in this direct pay marketplace is an alternative to the reimbursement system for those who have trouble accessing the reimbursement system, either because they're uninsured or what is now called underinsured with very high payments on deductibles.
Excellent. Thanks a lot, David. And let me call on Micah to talk to us a little bit about his company's approach to using technology for societal impact.
Excellent. Thanks a lot, Nana, and thanks to the NYU Stern Center for Sustainable Business for having me and for having this panel today. So I'm the managing director for UrbanX, which is the accelerator for startups reimagining city life. It's built by Mini, which is part of the BMW Group, and run in partnership with our venture partner, Urban Us. We've invested in 65 early stage companies, all focused on future of cities and climate. And we kind of unbundle that and think really about 7 distinct subcategories. So transportation and mobility, real estate and the built environment, energy and the grid, food, water, waste, infrastructure and industry, public health and safety, and then GovTech and civic tech. And we just see a massive amount of opportunity in cities and ultimately in building more resilient cities, given the climate threats that I think we collectively face. Mini is an automotive brand, actually was started during the first gasoline crisis during the late 1950s, and so brings a very human-centric approach to business and to design. And I think in many ways it is that kind of DNA within the company that is very much focused on people first. That's required when building companies that's focused on these areas of opportunity. So we back entrepreneurs. We're currently working with our 9th cohort of teams. We have 8 companies who are part of the program, who are really obsessed with a problem. And I think that, in many ways that's the critical thing that I would imagine, David, Samir, and probably yourself would argue is one of the most fundamental elements of being a founder, is really obsession with the problem as opposed to obsession with the solution, at least, first. And we think about solutions that can scale to 100 cities over the next 2 years or so. And so, just maybe 2 quick examples of that. We have a really interesting company that's focused on carbon sequestration, a company called Climate Robotics, which is building autonomous robots to sequester carbon. This is an area that I think has gotten a lot of shine recently, given Elon Musk donating $100 million to find solutions for carbon capture and sequestration. Mobilize is another really interesting company that we've worked with, using algorithms to help identify prospective EV owners and buyers. And so, I think in many ways we see a lot of teams who are using machine learning, robotics, data and software and hardware approaches to really solve big problems that are faced by customers who live in cities, and so in some cases those are real estate entities or utilities or governments themselves, and I think these are unprecedented times in terms of the complexity and interdimensionality of some of these problems. So I think entrepreneurs are particularly well positioned to bring new solutions to bear.
Excellent. Very interesting, Micah. Samir, can you talk a little bit about what you guys are doing at Isuzu to have impact using technology?
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Nana, and good morning, everyone. And thank you to the Stern Center for Sustainability for having us all today. Once again, my name is Samir Goel. I'm one of the co-founders of Esusu, which we launched in 2018 based on my co-founder and I's personal experiences with financial marginalization. And what we do is we work with large landlords to do three things. First and foremost, capture data to help our landlord partners understand risk in their portfolio, but then more importantly, work with tenants who are paying rent on time to report those positive payments into the credit bureaus so that folks can build and establish credit. And then for those residents who aren't able to pay rent due to a financial emergency of sorts, pair them with what we call a housing stability loan, essentially during COVID, all 0% interest, so that folks don't have to worry about keeping a roof over their head while they kind of get back on their feet. So we, like I mentioned, we started Isuzu in 2018. Today, we work with partners that cover 1.1 million rental units across 43 states in the United States. And to speak a little bit to the technology behind what we're doing, I think a lot of people think of technology in terms of emerging tech, right? Where you have the Internet of Things, you have machine learning, artificial intelligence, and actually what we end up doing is a lot less sexy than that. We're essentially a middleware business. And what that means is we had to figure out how do we connect using APIs to all these different systems that are being used to do essentially accounting. And then how do we take that data at scale and then transform it in a very highly regulated environment and then report it into the three credit bureaus. And then on top of that, we've built a layer of predictive analytics using machine learning and some of those more kind of forward-leaning technologies to really understand how do we assess risk, especially in an uncertain environment like COVID. And the reason that this is so important is because people are just being left behind today. Right now, I think there's 40 million people that are at risk of eviction based on essentially their outstanding rent. And even though there's an eviction moratorium, landlords are still filing evictions. That means that's on a permanent record for someone, and the government bailout is not sufficient to cover all the outstanding rent. More broadly, there's 150 million Americans that have less than $400 in their bank account for a financial emergency. And that kind of map of Americans that are being left behind is completely overlaid with those Americans who are renters, who predominantly are lower income, maybe immigrants, minorities, or just working kind of more blue collar jobs. And so that's really what we do, who we're focused on, and where the technology comes into play, so we can give people a fighting chance, especially during a time like this.
Excellent, Samir. Thanks a lot, and thank you all. And so now I would like to dig a little bit deeper into the various elements that are sort of core to the things that you guys are doing. And so we're going to have 3 minutes to dig deeper. And I'll start here with you, since you just talked about what you do in financial inclusion. And I think from my perspective as well, the problem that you guys are trying to solve is frankly a global problem, right? And so if you think about the US being, the most prosperous nation on earth and still having these statistics, you can imagine other areas of what they are. And what I want to dig in a little bit about is that against the backdrop of what you guys are doing vis-a-vis financial inclusion, and if you juxtapose that with what has been happening in the last 10, 15 years with fintechs and supposedly them coming into the market to kind of help, it seems to me, and we work with a lot of large banks, that the big problem that is still not solved, even with these fintechs, is access to credit and sufficient access to credit, right? And so can you dig a little bit deeper into what you guys are doing that promotes more access to credit? I suppose that the reporting to the credit bureaus is one of those things, but still I want to learn a little bit about how you think that what you guys are doing is part of the solution to providing more access to credit, which continues to be a problem that I think we haven't figured out as a society globally.
Yeah, Nana, this is a great question, and I'm glad you asked. So interestingly, at Isuzu, we actually started out as a savings business and thought that we needed to help people save. There's millions of Americans who can't save money. how can we help them do that better? And what we just heard resoundingly is everyone knows we need to save money, but what do we do when we make less than $40,000 a year? What do we do when there's a financial emergency or a healthcare emergency? We were saving, but all of our funds are now gone, and we're relying on a predatory payday loan that's at 400% interest just to get by, right? And so that really shifted our worldview to how do we solve this issue that Nana very eloquently put it, of credit access and inclusion. There's 40 million people who are kind of completely invisible or very, very thin file, and then there's a lot of other folks, maybe another 30 to 40 million, who are just very limited files that aren't being included in the system today. And the way that we think about it is this is a data problem, right? Right now we have a credit system that treats people as though you're guilty until you're proven innocent. If we don't know something about you, the assumption is that you're a bad credit risk, that you shouldn't be given access to capital, and that's where we're starting out. And so we think about this change in two ways. One is, what can we actually do today to help address that problem? And what we can do today is find an alternative data point, which is rental payment data, and then have that be incorporated into credit scores. So that way people can build and establish credit for something they're already doing and something that really touches the people that are being left behind. Because even if you don't have a credit score or a credit card, you probably have a roof over your head or are actively trying to have a roof over your head. And then the other thing is, from a Maslow's hierarchy point of view, the first thing that anyone will pay is their rental payment, right? So, you might not be able to pay your cell phone bill every time, but you probably go to pay your rental payment. Kind of taking a step further, though, how do we actually change this system, right? How do we actually change this mindset that we have and kind of give people a chance from the start? And we're doing a couple things with that. One is we're essentially creating our own underwriting algorithms and models to see what happens if there's someone that doesn't have a credit score, but we give them a 0% interest loan. Do they pay back? Is there the data that we can use to actually make a case for what if we treat people who don't have a credit score a little differently? And then two, how do we incorporate alternative data more broadly in underwriting decisions? A good example of this is mortgage lending. Mortgages or home ownership is the biggest driver of wealth in America. But right now, a lot of people aren't able to access it. And what's crazy is we underwrite mortgages without looking at rental data. So you could have paid rent on time for 40 years, but no one actually looks at that when you're applying for a mortgage. And that's just backwards, because every single empirical study actually says that the best predictor of whether or not you pay your mortgage is whether or not you pay rent, right? So it's not just how do we do something that's good for the world and for people, it actually will make better products from the financial borrower's point of view as well. It's going to be more accurate, it's going to be more effective, and we're going to be able to deploy more capital, which is a great thing for people, for society, and the broader world.
Excellent. Thanks a lot, Samir. And now I'm going to turn over to you, David. Clearly, Corona and the COVID has put into sharp relief the issue of healthcare. And I tell people that for all the billions and trillions that the world spends on arms and ammunition, et cetera, it had to take an invisible enemy to bring all of us to our knees. And the fact is that, without health, we can't have anything. So I want to talk a little bit, David, if you can share a little bit about when you think about healthcare and, of course, health tech, which is what you are trying to enable. How do you see that being broadly utilized with concerns about security and privacy of data and so forth and so on? But how can we still use telemedicine or health tech to provide great access to healthcare, especially in times like we are living in now?
Well, I think that's been one of the really positive developments in the last year, which is that payers around the world have gotten more comfortable with using remote technologies to treat patients. It's about payers, not technology. Most of this technology grandparents have been using to talk to their grandkids for 15 years. It gets to healthcare late because it's all about payment in healthcare, and because we have centralized payment in almost every country, unless that centralized payer says we're going to pay for remote treatment, there's no remote treatment. It's not about technology. But the good news, certainly in the US and in other countries as well, is that there's an understanding, not just in emergencies, that remote treatment, of which telemed is going to be the biggest part, at least to start, has a real place. And it has a place not just in a moment when people don't want to go into doctors' offices or hospitals, but it has a place in the sort of broader triaging and increasing of productivity the healthcare system needs to be able to manage cost, which is many issues that patients have are urgent and relatively easy to treat. And the idea that you need to drive to an office or find childcare or take some time off from work in order for something that a physician or even a nurse practitioner can handle in 5 to 10 minutes, I think the good news is that extreme burden on the healthcare system from the low end is going to be managed much better going forward. But even at the higher end, there's a better use of time involved in remote, whether it's remote diagnostics or even a chief medical officer of Sesame is a surgeon. So he had said to me that prior to 2020, he had never used telemed. He's a surgeon. How do you do telesurgery, right? Hospital didn't even talk to him about it. Going forward, he said he can't imagine any first consultation with a patient not being by some form of tele or video, because why does the patient need to come into a hospital for that meeting? Why does the doctor need it? And so I think this is a very strong positive that has come out of this crisis. And I think, unfortunately, business models may not work perfectly in terms of truly integrating telemedicine into treatment. After all, video is not a vertical, it's just a form of communication. But I think we'll see that get worked out over the next few years. I'm very optimistic about the prospects for that improving care generally.
Excellent. Thanks, David. And now, Micah, I'm going to go to you because the work that you are doing through UrbanX vis-a-vis cities, I think, has taken on proportions that perhaps not everybody is fully recognizing. I think we all understand the impact and the importance of cities as hubs for creativity, innovation, and that usually is in reference to large global cities like New York, Sao Paulo, LA, et cetera, et cetera. What the corona has shown is that, frankly, we can also leverage lesser cities to be part of the solution. If you think about, overcrowding, and now when we are living in a world where you need more space and where you can work remotely, then it becomes the contribution of smaller cities becomes a huge and important part of the problem. But within the background of politics, I think when people think about cities, it's a little more difficult to wrap your arms around than when you think about the private sector. Can you talk a little bit about how some of the work that you guys are doing is bringing together the impact of the private sector for cities so that we can have cities that can really be part of the solution from an environmental perspective, technology perspective, and even a quality of life perspective?
Yeah. What I'll suggest is that the term smart cities, I think, is going through maybe a reboot and maybe a rebrand. And I think in many ways, the expectation was that technology was going to kind of bring about some revolution. And I think in many ways, it's much more of an evolution that should be, at least based on the established principles of urban planning and public administration and community engagement. And I think that what we see is that urbanists are kind of taking over from technologists, and that in many ways, because tier 2 and tier 3 cities don't necessarily have some of the bureaucracy that places like New York have, they can actually be much more nimble in terms of implementing very forward-thinking solutions that are addressing the problems of the day. And what I'll suggest is that in many ways, climate is the biggest challenge that we face. The IEA came out and said that roughly half of the reductions that the world needs to swiftly achieve net zero emissions in the coming decades must come from technologies that have not yet reached the market today. So I think the question is, what is the role of the city, where generally, again, this is where new solutions have come from universities, from clusters of founders who view density as a real opportunity. And just to maybe put it in some perspective with regards to the last comments that David made around healthcare. So U.S. spending on energy innovation, it's just the U.S. here, but it's paltry. The federal government today spends less than $9 billion a year on energy innovation. And that's less than a quarter of what we invest in health innovation and less than 1/10 of what we invest in defense innovation. So it's really, I think, a question of what are our priorities, both as municipalities and also as a nation. And I think that what we saw in Texas over the last couple of weeks is fundamentally what happens when you do not invest in infrastructure and when you don't properly regulate the most critical and foundational infrastructure that we have, which is the electrical grid. And so in many ways, like, again, I think we are really at a tipping point where finally there's some serious leadership coming out of Washington, D.C. But I see, mayors and governors, I think, are still going to be on the front lines. And I think a lot of the solutions that we need for 21st century resilience and economic prosperity are going to be driven by local leaders.
Excellent, excellent. And so now I'm going to switch to our last series of questions, which will be about ways in which technology can be and has been an impediment to sustainability and growth. And from our perspective, as a company that works a lot with our clients using technology to improve their businesses, a couple of things that I worry about, and every time I have an opportunity to talk to clients, I talk about it, is how do we make sure that from a technology perspective, we are not impeding job creation when you think about the side effects of automation? How is it that we can encourage living wages and quality of work? Of course, huge amount of debate about the impact of social media and artificial intelligence on discrimination, and frankly, on our most fundamental asset as a society, which is democracy. And so with that, I want to talk to each of you. I want to hear from each of you ways in which you think technology has been an impediment or can be an impediment for us all to build a more sustainable world and more sustainable enterprises. And let me start, Micah, with you, since you just finished the last session. If you could talk a little bit about how you see technology being an impediment to what we should all be trying to achieve, which is build sustainable, profitable businesses and sustainable communities.
So I think that maybe, I'll answer this in three ways where I think that maybe there are some unintended consequences or technology as an impediment. And I will say that I do think that, again, when you have founders who are really open to, what customers need, I think a lot of these things potentially can be avoided, but also, what you really need is good policy. So, the first example, and I think New York is probably, the category leader here, is what's happening with mass transit versus the technological revolution of micromobility. And so we've seen, yesterday I looked up the data here in the city. MTA ridership was off 69.5% from the equivalent day in the prior year. That is a massive hemorrhage of riders. And I think a lot of it is due to the fact that you now have, you can hop on a scooter, you can own an e-bike. And so, not that this is necessarily all bad, but in many ways, like the growth of micromobility fleet services and the drop in storage prices has allowed people to basically forego the train, primarily because of psychological barriers. I think the second big thing is surveillance capitalism, and again, like this smart cities dialogue. I am a big fan of Shoshana Zuboff, and I think she's probably written, maybe the best articulation of the challenge that we face. But in many ways, as the citizen has become the product, and as data monetization has basically become the business model by which Silicon Valley, looks to find its next unicorn, there are real implications for what it means to be in public space. And that's something, again, that policymakers have to get out in front of. And then the last way I think that technology has kind of been a potential impediment is, the loneliness and social isolation that I think is compounded by COVID in dense cities. And, ultimately, again, if we're going to solve for climate, densification is a strategy that we need to pursue. And at the same time, how do you reinforce community? So just to put it in some perspective, something like 60% of people who live in multifamily residential housing will not renew their lease because there's no connection to their neighbors. And there are ways that, again, technology can actually be used to help build and grow a community, particularly now. But I think that the challenge has been, how do you deliver a product that ultimately meets the need both of building owners and also of landlords or property managers. So we have an interesting team called One Roof that's working to help to try to solve this. But I think fundamentally the social isolation that we're facing and the psychological crisis of COVID is probably an area where we're going to have to spend a whole lot more time and think about ways that we can really make an impact in that issue.
Yeah, let me turn it over to David. David, ways in which you see technology as an impediment in the health field.
Well, Sesame was founded to deal with the issue of cost for people who have trouble affording healthcare. But stepping back from our mission, all developed societies need to worry about this broadly, because in rich societies, healthcare is a secondary factor in people's health. Income, lifestyle, social choices and conditions are far more important in driving health than care, which means the more money society diverts from those things to care, the probably less well off those societies are. Technology comes into play because pretty much everywhere on earth, healthcare lacks the market mechanisms and consumer discipline we use to make sure that technology at least has some positive impact on productivity or quality or providing choices. Not always the case in healthcare. Basically, everywhere we look, healthcare is a cost plus business, which is the more I can convince a government or an insurer that healthcare costs me, the more I get paid. That's a perverse set of incentives with which to bring technology in. And so one of the problems we see, and this is not just limited to the US, is that a lot of technology sold does not have those clear benefits, but does justify either an additional hand in the pocket of a government or an insurer, or an additional level of cost. And how you bring in, in other industries we look at, there may be a battle between some of these positive incentives and some negative social costs that need to be worked out. But in healthcare, there's unfortunately this perverse incentive of prove to me it costs more and I'll pay you more. And when you look at a lot of technology that's been successful in healthcare, unfortunately, it's not clear it has improved the patient experience or increased productivity of the sector or provided choices that weren't available before. Some has, not unique, it's not uniquely negative, and a lot of people are working very hard to make the patient experience better. But unfortunately, those incentives are kind of unique to healthcare and have made the classic one, of course, being electronic health records in the US, where there's a lot of measurements that suggest it has reduced productivity in the sector, in which case it's got to be the only place that electronic records have actually reduced productivity. And I think some patients would say it's reduced the quality of care and interaction with physicians. It has, however, added meaningfully to cost. And that's something that we as societies have to be vigilant about. And I'd like to think Sesame as a marketplace at least encourages some positive incentives in the innovation we'll see around technology.
Excellent. Thanks, David. And then lastly, Samir, talk to us a little bit about how you see technology being an impediment in terms of the work that you guys are trying to do around financial inclusion.
Yeah, thanks so much, Nana. I think, I'll have to be echoing a lot of what's already been said from Micah and David, but in terms of our industry, there's really three things I see. One, I spoke earlier about the power of data for good, but obviously this is a double-edged sword. And so, in real estate, people are making more and more efficient decisions around things like tenant screening, approving loans, not approving loans. And that can sometimes go in the opposite direction and lead to more people being left behind, more discrimination, more people that probably could have rented an apartment that may not be able to because we're just trying to be more and more efficient with things like screening. And so there is that double-edged sword of how things like screening and approvals work. I think the other thing, and this is something that David was just touching on, is we're adding a lot of technology to apartments and residences And that's really increasing the cost of those places. And so it's not necessarily a great thing all the time, because now we basically have developers that are incredibly focused on building high quality, like high amenity buildings, because that's where they can make the most money and that's where they can mark things up the most. And the only way to actually create affordable housing is through government subsidies. And so we've created a system where developers can either pay for high rises or they can get government subsidies to build affordable housing. The concept of naturally affordable housing has disappeared. And I think one of the contributors is the realization that you can add a bunch of amenities and jack up the costs on a premium, and that's where developers can make the most money. And then number 3 is really just, are we spending our human capital on the right problems, right? And kind of like David talked about in the healthcare industry, I think a lot of people are focused on solutions that are problems of luxury rather than real problems that need to be solved around housing affordability, housing sustainability, the fact that, inflation has outpaced the wage growth 10x, right? There's a lot of real problems around financial inclusion, credit access, and housing that need to be solved, but we've done a really good job of solving problems that, while good to have solved, are not really as critical. And really, we need our kind of the people that are thinking big to be focused on problems that really need to be solved.
Excellent. Well, thank you all. And we have come to the end of sort of our discussions. We're going to open it up to the audience for some questions for the next 5 minutes. And we already do have some questions. There's 2 questions here that I will share, and we'll figure out how we respond to them. So the first question comes from Rachel, and this, I think, is a question directed at me, so I'll try to answer that. How do you square the efficiency goal and increased automation with responsibility to employees when automation will replace many employees? So that's a great question, Rachel, and it's actually a question that we at Qintess just about a week and a half ago spent some time discussing through a panel on analytics competitor with Professor Tom Davenport of MIT and Babson. And I think people have this idea that automation is really going to be a substitute for people. The reality is that that's not exactly the case. Automation, we think, and this is what sort of the data shows, is going to be a complement to people. In other words, at least from Professor Davenport research, most of the people that are going to lose their jobs are going to be the people that refuse to get retrained to be able to work with the automation. And I'll give you an example from our own business where we have a robotics automation practice where we help companies with RPA for automating and digitalizing things. And what we found out is that, yes, some people may lose some jobs, especially on the lower end, clerical, but what actually makes the solution work best for the company is when a lot of people know how to use those tools. And so at Qintess, for example, what we are doing, what we're encouraging customers to do is we are moving people from using certain technologies and training them to use more and more analytics, more machine learning tools so that they work hand in hand with this automation. So I think the equation is not, I don't think it's a zero-sum game. And this is kind of what we try to encourage customers. Anybody thinks that they're going to automate and have a lot amount of savings, that's actually not going to work, because very quickly you're going to realize that you're going to create more costs. The best way is to help your customers be trained or capacity build. And so the investment in capacity building is the way in which you square that efficiency goal, Rachel. So hopefully that answers your question. The next question is from Alexandre, and it's, how do you create a sustainable culture, starting from leadership, buying all the way to employee empowerment, incentivization, which goes hand in hand with a digital tech transformation? I'll direct that to Micah, who works a lot with startups and so forth. So Micah, can you try to respond to that question? How one creates a sustainable culture from the leadership all the way to employees that would also go hand in hand with a tech transformation?
Well, so I think technology is ultimately a tool, and it's certainly not an end. It's a means to an end. And I think, what we see at the early stage is founders being really intentional about the kind of culture that they want to build within their teams. And I think that founders who are not intentional about the culture ultimately wind up having to grapple with it later. And so the nice thing about operating at a very early stage is you can really help to shape the DNA of the teams, and that fundamentally means, what kind of team are you going to build? How are you going to approach data and data ethics and privacy? What is your compensation package? I mean, I think the ESG conversation is not just for large companies. I think increasingly, we see at least is it's people starting companies and being, really mindful about the kinds of organizations that they want to build. And so, we've certainly seen the growth in B corporations, over the last 10 years or so. But I think that the challenge for a lot of tech companies is, being put into the category of impact and impact investment. And again, I think that those lines have started to blur and shift a bit. But generally speaking, for a scalable, repeatable technology business, there are some, there are some connotations with being kind of put into the traditional impact class. And I think more and more what we've seen is generalist investors looking to get into climate, but also paying attention to things like human capital and team culture as well.
Excellent. And so let me follow up on that question with David, who I know, David, you've been involved in large established companies before, and Micah talked a little bit about startups and how you can build a culture. And I know that, we run a business, and part of how we grow is acquisitions. So sometimes you go into a company that already has a culture. What would you say, David, about how you can still have cultural change that aligns with digital or technology transformation in an established company where perhaps, you come in there and you're not a founder and therefore don't have the luxury of selecting the teams?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think the fundamental issue in building a sustainable culture is flexibility, is an understanding that over different stages of your company's life, people are going to want to join or stay or leave for reasons that change over time. You put together a small team in a startup, they're motivated by the mission, they're passionate about building a company. It's quite different, particularly if you do an acquisition of an established company. The first thing people are afraid of is losing their jobs. That's a very different thing to deal with than the excitement of the passion of a startup. I think great organizations that grow over time recognize that things change. And they try to be open to the reasons people come to work every day, recognizing that's going to change based on the life and status of the business. I think some companies I've seen that are very inflexible think their culture must last even as the business alters. And I don't think that's the type of sensitivity to the actual human beings who join and why. People who join an established business, maybe more established in their own lives, may have a lot of mouths to feed at home. They think differently. They're at a different stage in their life. Great companies, I think, are really great at satisfying a broad range of human needs from work. And they do that by being flexible and not being monolithic about culture.
Excellent. And now we're going to ask the last question because unfortunately, for as great as our panel has been, our time is coming to the end. And this last question really, and we're gonna pay homage to one of my favorite cities, New York. This question is about New York and it's from Gabriel. Can anyone comment on the positive or negative impact of buildings on work-life environment with smart technology and quality? And he references what's been advertised in New York City, for example, Vanderbilt 1, which is a building next to Grand Central Station. I don't know Vanderbilt 1, but perhaps some of you guys may know Vanderbilt 1, and you can comment on the positive or negative impact of that. I think, Samir, you talked a little bit about, technology being put into buildings and so forth and so on. So I think this is what this is referring to with a focus on New York City. So I don't know who wants to take this on, but this will be our last question.
Yeah, thanks, Nana. Happy to take a stab at this one. I am somewhat familiar with well buildings. Think of it as akin to something like LEEDs for hotels. And broadly speaking, I think the concept is a good one, right? How do we create a more thriving community where we live? How do we get to know our neighbors better? How do we kind of have a place where you can be healthy and happy and wholesome, right? And it's not just essentially a roof over your head. That conceptually makes sense. The concern that I would have, or the potential ripple effect of that is, are we only able to offer that sort of a limited accommodation to people who have a lot of wealth, right? And how do we actually work to create housing up and downstream the market that is holistic, that does have a sense of community and does have kind of healthy living circumstances for everyone? Because right now you have, housing where you have a beautiful community, there's a lot of health and fitness type of things, and it's adapted for COVID and everything. And then you go up to, the Bronx, and you've got, 1 million people packed into 300 units, and there's barely the ability to fix an AC or get an oven working, right? And so there's that sort of juxtaposition. And for me, I think the well building concept is phenomenal, but how do we kind of create maybe a watered down version or some version that's a little more accessible for everyone also?
Excellent. So with that, we have come to the end of our panel. Thank you all for an excellent discussion. I want to encourage all the folks here to follow up with each one of us that you may want to explore this in some depth, and our information is going to be available for the good folks, from the good folks at NYU. And with that, Alisa and Elisa at NYU, we want to turn it over to you. Thank you, David, Micah, and Samir for an excellent panel. Good morning, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nana, and the rest of our panelists for such an engaging talk. We'll be taking a short break and reconvening here in about 8 minutes at 10 a.m. for our panel on innovations in sustainable investing. We'll be hearing from Tony Davis of Inherent Group, Gordon Fowler of Glenmead, and our moderator, Jillian Tett of Financial Times. So we'll see you back here in about 8 minutes. Thanks so much.